Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Our today's lecture is physical quantities. What are physical quantities? In this lecture, I will discuss first what is a physical quantity and then what are the types of physical quantity. These two things will be discussed in this lecture. So first, what is a physical quantity? The quantity which can be measured is called as a physical quantity. The quantity which can be measured is called as a physical quantity. For example, we can measure length. So length is a physical quantity. Also we can measure mass. So mass is a physical quantity. Also we can measure time. So time is a physical quantity. So there are different physical quantities. For example, length, mass, time, temperature, electric current, luminous intensity, amount of substance, speed, velocity, acceleration, force, work, momentum, torque. All these are physical quantities. Because we can measure all these quantities, so all these are the physical quantities. So there are so many other physical quantities also. Next is the types of physical quantity. There are two types of physical quantity. Number one, the base physical quantities. Number two, derived physical quantities. These are the two types of physical quantity. Now first is the base physical quantities or the base quantities. The quantities which are not derived from other quantities are called base physical quantities. What is the definition of base physical quantity? The quantities which are not derived from other quantities are called base physical quantities. Or the quantities in terms of whom other quantities are defined are called base physical quantities. Or there is another definition. The quantities which are arbitrarily chosen by the scientist for building block as a building block of a system are called base physical quantities. The quantities which are arbitrarily chosen by the scientist as a building block of a system are called base physical quantities. For example, length, mass, time, temperature, electric current, luminous intensity, amount of substance. These are the base physical quantities of the SI system. These 7 are the base physical quantities of the SI system. Because the scientists have chosen these 7 quantities for making SI system, so these are the base physical quantities of the SI system. So these 7 are the base physical quantities. Now second type of physical quantities are the derived physical quantities. What are derived physical quantities? The quantities which are derived from the base physical quantities are called derived physical quantities. Or the quantities which are derived from other quantities are called derived physical quantities. For example, area, volume, speed, velocity, force, work, momentum, torque, energy, all these are the derived physical quantities. So all these are the derived physical quantities. And there are so many other examples of the derived physical quantities. Now these base physical quantities and derived physical quantities, they belong to different systems. Now as far as the systems are concerned, there are 4 popular systems. For example, SI system, which is called System International. Second is MK system, that is meter kilogram second system. Third is CGS system, centimeter gram second system. FPS system, that is foot pound second system. These are the 4 systems, popular systems. Now every physical quantity belongs to SI system or MKS system, CGS system or CGS system. So every system has its own basic quantities and derived quantities. Every system has its own basic quantities and derived quantities. Now first the basic quantities. First basic quantities of the four systems. Now SI system has 7 basic quantities. SI means System International. System International has 7 basic quantities. That is length, mass, time, temperature, electric current, luminous intensity and amount of substance. These are 7 basic quantities of the SI system. Now the basic quantities of MKS system. MKS system has 3 basic quantities: length, mass, time. These are 3 basic quantities of the MKS system. Third is the CGS system. CGS system has 3 basic quantities. This is length, mass, time. These are 3 basic quantities of the CGS system. Fourth is the FPS system. FPS system has 3 basic quantities: length, weight, time. Length, weight, time. These are 3 basic quantities of the FPS system. So SI system has 7 basic quantities, MKS system has 3 basic quantities, CGS system has 3 basic quantities, and FPS system has 3 basic quantities. So these are the basic quantities of these 4 systems, and all the other quantities are the derived quantities in these 4 systems. For example, SI system has 7 basic quantities. All the other quantities of SI system are derived quantities. MKS system has 3 basic quantities. All the other quantities are the derived quantities of the MKS system. CGS system has 3 basic quantities. All the other quantities are derived quantities. FPS system has 3 basic quantities. So all the other quantities are the derived quantities of the FPS system. So these are the basic quantities I have discussed before you. Now one thing, an SI system, MKS system, CGS system, mass is the basic quantity. But an FPS system, weight is the basic quantity, not the mass. So this is a difference between FPS system and other systems. So mass is derived quantity in FPS system. In FPS system, weight is the basic quantity, not the mass is the basic quantity. Now the derived quantities of the 4 systems. SI system has 7 basic quantities. All the other quantities are the derived quantities of the SI system. For example, what are the derived quantities of SI system? Area, volume, speed, velocity, acceleration, force, work, torque, momentum, energy, pressure, power. All these are the derived quantities of the SI system. All these are derived quantities of SI system. And there are so many other derived quantities of SI system. Next is MKS system. MKS system has 3 basic quantities, but all the other quantities are derived quantities of MKS system. For example, area, volume, speed, velocity, acceleration, force, work, torque, momentum, energy, pressure. All these are the derived quantities of MKS system. All these are derived quantities. Third is CGS system. It has 3 basic quantities, but all other quantities are derived quantities. For example, area, volume, speed, velocity, acceleration, force, work, torque, momentum, energy. All these are derived quantities of CGS system. Last is FPS system. What are the derived quantities of FPS system? FPS system has 3 basic quantities, but all the other quantities are derived quantities. For example, area, volume, speed, velocity, acceleration, force, work, torque, momentum, energy, pressure, power, mass. All these are the derived quantities of FPS system. Now here in FPS system, mass is a dried quantity. It is not the basic quantity. So all these four systems have their dried quantities. I have discussed for you the dried quantities of these four systems. Now next thing I want to discuss for you how we get the dried quantities. How we get the dried quantities? We get the dried quantities by multiplying or dividing the other quantities. For example, if we multiply two quantities, we get a new quantity. This new quantity is a dried quantity. Also, if we divide one quantity on the other quantity, we get a new quantity. This new quantity is a dried quantity. So by multiplying or dividing different quantities, we get the dried quantities. Now I want to discuss with you different examples of the dried quantities. For example, area. How we get area? Area is a dried quantity. How we get it? By multiplying length and width, we get area. So area is a dried quantity. Also, second dried quantity is volume. How we get volume? By multiplying length, width and height, we get volume. Since by multiplying length, width and height, we get volume, so volume is a dried quantity. Third is force. Force is a dried quantity. How we get it? By multiplying mass and acceleration, we get force. So force is a dried quantity because by multiplying mass and acceleration we get force. So force is a dried quantity because we get the force from mass and acceleration. Next is speed. Speed is a dried quantity. How we get it? By dividing distance and time, we get speed. So speed is a dried quantity because we get speed from distance and time. Next is density. Density is a dried quantity. How we get it? By dividing mass on volume, we get the density. So density is a dried quantity. So by multiplying two quantities, we get the dried quantities, or by dividing one quantity on the other quantity, we get the dried quantities. So this is the way of making the dried quantities. Now there are so many other dried quantities. For example, acceleration is a dried quantity. How we get it? By dividing velocity on time, we get acceleration. In the same way, work is a dried quantity. How we get it? By multiplying force and distance, we get work. So work is a dried quantity. Power is a dried quantity. How we get it? By dividing work over time, we get power. So power is a dried quantity. Pressure is a dried quantity. How we get it? By dividing force over area, we get the pressure. So pressure is a dried quantity. So we get the dried quantities from the other quantities by multiplying or dividing. So in our today's lecture, we discussed the physical quantities, types of physical quantities, and how we get the dried quantities. This is our today's lecture. Now I want to show you my lecture in written form. In this lecture, we discuss the physical quantities. So two things we discuss in this lecture: physical quantities and types of physical quantities. Now this is a definition of physical quantity. That is, quantity which can be measured is called as a physical quantity. This is a definition of physical quantity. Now these are examples of physical quantities. There are different examples of physical quantities. All these are physical quantities. You can see. Now these are types of physical quantities. That is the base quantities. First is the base quantities. And these are the examples of base quantities. Next, these are the dried physical quantities. The quantities which are dried from the base, from the other quantities. are called dried quantities. These are different examples of the dried quantities. Now these base quantities and dried quantities belong to different systems. So there are four popular systems, that is SI system, MKS system, CGS system, and fourth is the FPS system. These are the four systems. Now here is the chart of basic quantities of the four systems. These are the basic quantities of SI system. These are the basic quantities of MK system. These are basic quantities of CGS system. These are basic quantities of FPS system. Now this is a chart of dried quantities of the four systems. Dried quantities are given in detail for the four systems. Now all these are the dried quantities of SI system. These are dried quantities of MK system. These are dried quantities of CGS system. These are dried quantities of FPS system. This is a complete chart of dried quantities. Now how we get dried quantities? By multiplying two quantities or by dividing one quantity on the other quantity. We get the dried quantities. Now this is an example of area. Area is a dried quantity. For this rectangle, how we get the area? By multiplying length and width. We multiply the length, width, and then we get area. So area is a dried quantity. Now volume is a dried quantity. How we get it? By multiplying length, width, and height. So here we multiply length, width, and height, and we get volume. So volume is a dried quantity. Now speed is a dried quantity. How we get it? By dividing distance on time. Here we divide, this is a car moving, and this is a distance covered, this is a time. So by dividing the distance on time, we get speed. So speed is a dried quantity. Here force is a dried quantity. How we get it? By multiplying mass and acceleration. By multiplying mass and acceleration, we get force. So force is a dried quantity. Here acceleration is a dried quantity. How we get it? By dividing velocity on time. Work is a dried quantity. How we get it? By multiplying force and displacement. Power is a dried quantity. We get it from dividing work over time. Press is a dried quantity. We get it from dividing force over acceleration. Force over area. Also, potential energy is a dried quantity. Kinetic energy is a dried quantity. Torque is a dried quantity. So all these are the dried quantities. So today we have discussed the physical quantities and the types of physical quantities and how we get the dried quantities. So this was our today's lecture. Thank you.